The White House is one of the most interesting buildings in the world. It's 55,000 square feet, comprising of 132 rooms, 35 bathrooms, a tennis court, and a bowling alley, all sitting on 18 acres of land in the United States' capital city, is not just one of the most protected places on the planet, but also functions as an office, a residence, and a living museum where history is actively playing out on a regular basis. But the White House didn't always look like this, and not every president would live within its walls. As the United States was still being formed, there was hardly a consensus about where the capital city should be located, much less where the president should live. But throughout the duration of the nation it plays a part in presiding over, the White House, or as it was originally called, the Presidential Palace, has gone through quite a few changes, including being burned down. This is the story of the White House, and this is Learn Something New. When the United States was first formed, it didn't really need a residence for the president to stay in because there was no president presiding over the executive branch. In fact, there was no executive branch of the government. For the first 5 years after the end of the Revolutionary War, the governing body of the United States of America, stemming from the Articles of Confederation, only had Congress at the helm. After Shays' Rebellion, which saw ex-revolutionary soldiers taking part in violent attacks against the government for their policies that had led to many of the farmers from Massachusetts to become destitute, it became clear that adjustments to the American government were necessary, with many feeling that there was a strong need for more executive power, with George Washington willing to step into the role of presiding over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where a new document to replace the Articles of Confederation would be written. The Constitution created here would outline a new position at the head of the executive branch of the government, the President, acting as Chief Executive, Commander-in-Chief, Chief Diplomat, and Chief Legislator. George Washington would then become the only president in United States history to be unanimously voted into office by the Electoral College. And so, at 12:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1789, George Washington would be escorted to Federal Hall, a building in Lower Manhattan that originally served as New York City's City Hall, and then later, the meeting place for the Congress of the Confederation. After being sworn into the office of the presidency, George Washington would live in the Franklin House, also known as the Samuel Osgood House in Manhattan, but he wouldn't stay there for very long. The Franklin House was owned by Samuel Osgood, a Massachusetts politician, with Congress renting it so that George Washington would have a place to stay while away from Mount Vernon. It had a private presidential office, a public office, and living quarters. However, it didn't quite have enough space overall, and so, after less than a year of staying there, Washington would move into the newly constructed Alexander Macomb House. Once again, a residence leased for presidential use. Although this second residence worked much better for Washington than the first, he would stay there for even less time, only occupying it from February to August in the year 1790. This wasn't because there was anything wrong with the house, but rather because the nation's capital had moved from New York City to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with the president needing to move along with it. This was clearly not a move that was planned well in advance, because they were actually in the process of building out a permanent residence for the president in Manhattan in 1790, called the Government House, and it was finished soon after Washington left the state. Instead, it would become the residence of New York Governor George Clinton. As he arrived in Philadelphia, George Washington would stay in the so-called President's House, remaining there for the next 7 years. The President's House was located just 1 block away from Independence Hall, then known as the Pennsylvania State House, and was owned by the founding father Robert Morris, who you can learn more about in my video discussing how Morris helped finance the Revolutionary War. Morris had bought the house in 1781 and renovated it while he lived there, operating as the US's Superintendent of Finance, a position roughly equivalent to today's Secretary of Treasury. Although Washington would finish out his term as president there, he knew that it wouldn't be the forever home of the highest office in the nation. In fact, the Residence Act of 1790 established that the capital of the United States would no longer be Philadelphia, but rather an entirely new city along the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, a place that Washington himself handpicked, taking land from both Maryland and Virginia. And they would call it the District of Columbia, naming the city within after the man who chose its location. Though the District of Columbia would eventually be abbreviated and now most refer to it as Washington, D.C., to design the city, as well as the new residence of the president, Washington appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a military engineer turned civil engineer after the Revolutionary War. His proposed grid system for the city had the capital of the nation at its center, with the White House nearby. L'Enfant had bold ambitions for the White House, which he called the President's Palace. He wanted the White House to have public gardens and monuments, and although the White House would become the largest residence in America at the time of its completion, L'Enfant had imagined a building that was actually 5 times larger than was actually constructed. However, when architect James Hoban was brought onto the project, he designed a building that was much more conservative given the constraints on time and money, with it costing the federal government $242,371.83 as it was built out over the course of 8 years. Even though it wasn't quite finished yet, when the building was close enough to become livable, second President of the United States, John Adams, moved in, spending the remaining 4 months of his presidency there. Since then, every president has stayed at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, though not necessarily in the same building, because, as fate would have it, just 12 years after the construction of the White House was completed, it would be burnt to the ground. On June 18, 1812, war erupted once again between the United States and Britain over trade disputes and because they had begun the practice of impressment, essentially capturing Americans from merchant vessels and forcing them to serve on British Royal Navy ships. The US saw mixed results from the battles that ensued, and in August of 1814, 2 years after the US had initially invaded Canada, which was then a territory for the British began a major string of raids along the East Coast. In a major push for a propaganda victory, the British launched an offensive into Maryland, defeating the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg and continuing to push further inland. However, the Secretary of War at the time, John Armstrong, insisted that the British wouldn't dare attack the US capital, even as an anonymous letter came in detailing the British admiral's plan to attack Washington, D.C., even as the mayor of D.C. pleaded with him, describing the city as defenseless. Alas, action was far too slow, and the British raided D.C., setting fire to the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, and congressional chambers within the still uncompleted Capitol building, before going on to do the same with the White House. It was on August 24, 1814, that Washington, D.C. burned. The White House would be rebuilt after the War of 1812, with the original architect James Hoban coming back to D.C. for the project, and by 1817 it was completed. But Hoban wasn't finished. Throughout the 1820s, he worked to expand the White House, adding the South Portico in 1824 and a North Portico 5 years later. Even after Hoban would pass away, improvements would continue. For example, in 1833, they added running water, and the 1840s saw the introduction of natural gas and centralized heating, as well as gas lights, though these would be replaced in 1891 as electricity was brought in. Over time, massive expansions were added as well. The West Wing office complex was built in 1902, which today holds areas like the Situation Room and the Oval Office. However, it would be another 40 years before the East Wing would be constructed to serve as office space for the First Lady and her staff. Another development at the turn of the century was the name of the building, the White House. On October 17, 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt officially changed the name of the building from the Executive Mansion to the White House. He didn't come up with this himself, but rather, ever since 1798, the sandstone exterior of the building would receive a lime-based whitewash to preserve the outer walls from moisture and cracking during winter. Newspapers would occasionally refer to the building as the White House throughout the 1800s, and it was only a matter of time before its nickname became its official name. But the White House has never really been fully completed. Throughout US history, there's been numerous improvements to the structure, from a bunker being constructed underneath during World War II to a complete gutting of the interior from 1948 to 1952. In fact, the White House just finished a $50 million complete overhaul of the Situation Room, where the president takes some of the most sensitive national security meetings. As technology advances and the original structure ages, a building that houses such critical personnel and information will likely experience upgrades with the cutting edge of technology, just as it had with running water and electricity earlier in its history. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. If you feel like you learned something in this video, hit the like button below and subscribe for more videos like this one. And don't forget, we just launched a Patreon. If you want to help financially support the channel so we can keep improving the quality of these videos, check out the link in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.